Good afternoon, everybody. Happy to be here. This is really exciting. So I got a poem for y'all. By the way, my name is Dr. Tony Keefe Jr. Bring you greetings from Chocolate City in my wonderful office. Anyway, poem goes like this. Well, first I have to explain this poem. There's more to this thing. What are we talking about? Buddy of mine, he's actually an educator, Black dude. He called me one day, this was a couple years ago, and he was like, man, Tony, I don't seem to be doing anything right? I can't seem to get my students to learn this. I can't seem to feel like he was just sort of beating himself up. The narratives, right? I'm thinking about the narratives that he was sharing with himself, they just weren't healthy, right? And so I was thinking about him when we got off the phone, and I was trying to, come up with words, sort of inspiration and encouragement to inspire him to just be great and know that he's wonderful and to kind of reverse some of the narratives. And this poem came out. And so the title of this poem is called Awake and Awesome. And while I'm not a religious person, I do know the significance of the Black church, and I need us all to do a little participation. And if you can, take your hand and put it out in front of you like this. I want you to look at the palm of your hand, be like, hey, hand, take that hand and pat yourself on the back. Say, good job, me. I love myself. I'm proud of myself. It's virtual. I'm here, right? I want you to take that same hand and pretend like you got somebody next to you and pat your screen and tell them good job. Say, good job, Dr. Bettina Love. Good job, Heather Jenkins. Good job, Valerie. I appreciate you. I see you. Thank you. So this poem is for all of us. If you have not heard how amazing and awesome you are ever, or let alone today, this poem is for you. I also learned that this poem was also for myself too. We'll talk about that. The other thing that I like to note before this one real quick, I don't know a lot of disclaimers, but I like to explain things. If you've not ever read Paulo Coelho's The Alchemist, check it out. This poem is also inspired by the stories in that book. So, we fear what we love. Y'all, being awesome is a monster trapped inside of closets that watches asleep, that steals our dreams in the dark, and when we awake, we forget how amazing we could be if we just turn the lights on. If we just pulled the cover from over our eyes, placed our feet on the ground, and boldly proclaimed that we are not afraid of greatness. That no matter how many nights we shiver, scared of our own success, we will at some point get a full night's rest and we will rise with the sun. And like the sun, y'all, we will be bright and blinding and bold and hot and huge, and people will need us to survive the cold and the night. And we will awaken, y'all, as warriors of weary, as soldiers of failure, as griots of fate, armed with weapons of mass construction. We will build ourselves a fortress of power, protecting ourselves from hating to be loved, and our capacity to be godlike, and our right to be present, and our calling to be parents, offsprings of our victories and ancestors to heartbreak and loneliness and empty pockets and grumbling bellies and confusion. And we will no longer hold our pillows too tight at night, wishing it were a warm body or a healthy diagnosis, or that phone call you've been waiting on from daddy, or a note that says, I love you, from the person you actually want to love you. And we will awaken with muscles upon our shoulders that are strong enough to hold the world up when people need us to hold the world up because they are tired of holding the world up. And we will awaken with our voices in harmony and pitch that makes a whisper seem like a rocket ship, and a rocket ship sound like, yo, I miss you. And we will tiptoe down hallways, making footprints feel like earthquakes, and we will awaken. All those sleeping, all those afraid to be brilliant, all of you afraid to be acknowledged for daring to be different. For those of you who run, when you should stand. For those of you who hush, when you should command. For those of you who need to realize you can't hide in the light. It sticks to you like brown does on my black skin, like sap from trees rooted inside of sweet soil. I need everybody here to know that you're stars. Literally, I see you in the sky, defying laws of space, time, and gravity, because humans are not supposed to fly, but you, literacy lab, glide like the first leaves in autumn. Your silhouettes strut in daylight and they dance with the moon. You are all part of a collective, a critical mass of intellectuals, and you are governed by some kind of divine knowledge, which means you are meant to be here with the purpose. Just like I am meant to be here with the purpose, we are all purposefully meant to be here so that the sick become a healer, so the timid can become a leader, so the weary can become a teacher, the boogeyman He used to be afraid of his brilliant Black self, became a poet. Thank you all so much. Looking forward to the rest of this conversation. I got another poem for y'all later on. Thank you. Peace, peace, peace.
Thank you, Tony. And good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our second Ascend event titled Forging the Narrative. My name is Valerie Manu, and I am the Marketing Communications Manager at the Literacy Lab. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a couple of housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's webinar. Please keep in mind that this event is being recorded and the recording will be made available after the webinar. Our participants are muted for quality assurance. If you have any questions or comments during the event, please put it in the question box. We will answer all questions during the Q&A portion of the program. Thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it over to our CEO, Heather Jenkins.
Thank you so much, Val, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. My name is Heather Jenkins. My pronouns are she, her, and it is truly my honor and privilege to serve as the Literacy Lab's CEO. I've been in education and nonprofits for about 21 years now, and I have been laser focused on working toward greater equity with and in partnership with students, schools, and communities most impacted by racial and economic inequities. And that is certainly something that led me here to the Literacy Lab and part of the many, many reasons why I really have deep love and appreciation for the Leading Men Fellowship Program. So I want to give a quick overview of our event today. As you know, we started out with an amazing poetry performance from Dr. Tony Keith Jr., and we will have another one of those coming up. After a few more remarks from me, I will turn it over to Ivan Douglas, who will give a little bit of an overview of the fellowship program. That will be followed by a video giving more detail on the program itself. We will go into our first panel conversation from there. And that will really be focused on the barriers preventing young men of color from seeking education-focused careers. We will take a little screen break since many of us get zoomed out at this point in the day. We will come back and have another fabulous performance from Dr. Tony Keith Jr. And then we'll go into our second panel, which will be focused on the key actions individuals and organizations can take to create a new narrative around men of color in education. We will have a little bit of Q&A, and then Rodney Robinson will wrap us up from there. So I want to take a moment to thank our amazing panelists and speakers, Dr. Tony Keith Jr., Jason Bell, Dr. Tristan Glenn, Dr. Bettina Love, Dr. Creston Lynch, Curtis Penn, and Rodney Robinson. We are so grateful to have a mix of authors, scholars, activists, policymakers, and educators join us to engage in a lively and timely discussion about the role of systemic inequities in preventing young men of color from engaging in education-focused careers and what we can and should do to mitigate those inequities. I also want to thank you, our audience, for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for this incredibly important conversation. We deeply appreciate your commitment and your support. The Literacy Lab understands the significant need for high-impact education models and professionals in communities with which we partner. Our goal is to work alongside students, schools, and communities to offer culturally responsive literacy education services. With that, we know that our people, meaning our tutors, our fellows, and our staff, are the heart and soul of this organization, and we are dedicated to providing resources to invest in them as people first and as the drivers of our work. Another goal for our work is that each year we have tutors and fellows serving as teachers and paraprofessionals in our regions. And some are even working in the schools in which they served. We look forward to a day where current students become tutors and fellows, and current tutors and fellows become staff, leadership. I'm looking for one of y'all to take my job one day when I retire, and our board members as well. This work is all about creating opportunity and access pipelines through an unwavering focus on equity and anti-racism. Thank you all for partnering with us on this journey. And with that, I will turn things over to Ivan.
Great, thank you, Heather. Good morning for some, good afternoon for others. My name is Ivan Douglas, and it is my pleasure to serve as the Literacy Lab's National Director of the Leading Men Fellowship. As Heather noted, we are here today because of our passion and commitment to advance educational equity for our youngest learners in traditionally underserved and underrepresented communities, as well as our charge to empower young men of color with the tools and resources they need to pursue their college, career, and life goals in education and beyond. Before we begin, I just want to go through a few slides that gives an overview of what the Literacy Lab is all about, as well as the Leading Men Fellowship. And then I will hand it over to Mr. Rodney Robinson, who will lead us in our panel discussion for this morning. So now you should see on your screen a slide that just gives a visual representation of the Literacy Lab and the scope and reach of the work that we're doing. The Literacy Lab did start in 2009 with the goal of trying to close literacy gaps that we know exist in pre-K through third grade. But the Leading Men Fellowship started in 2016 in partnership with DC Public Schools and something called the Empowering Males of Color Initiative. I was a teacher at the time, and I knew immediately that this was a program I wanted to be a part of because of so many of my young men that were in my mentoring organization that said they weren't quite sure about what their next steps would be, but they did know they wanted to stay connected. And that's really what the Leading Men Fellowship is all about. And so you'll see in the next slide a little bit more about what we've been doing through the years, but on here you're able to, if you zoom in, you see that we have a pretty wide footprint. We've started the fellowship in DC, but expanded to Virginia, as well as Baltimore and Milwaukee. And this year, we're super excited that we'll be going into 3 new locations. We'll be in Atlanta, we'll be in Phoenix, Arizona, as well as Cincinnati, Ohio. In terms of what are we doing? What are we doing with Leading Men in classrooms? So Leading Men Fellows are young men of color ages 18 to 24, and we're placing them in preschool classrooms for an entire school year. So the recent high school graduates that do not have a bachelor's degree. And so we're trying to capture our young men at a critical moment where they're deciding what their next steps could and should be. We do pay them $15 an hour. They're working 25 to 30 hours a week. But what I think is a secret sauce of what we do is that we're providing wraparound services, supports to make sure that we're empowering our young men to think about what their next steps, what reasonable next steps they can take so they can be a part of something that really makes a difference in the lives of our community. And so we do that through a lot of training, professional development training that's led by our program staff as well as our coaching staff. And fellows work with their children every single day throughout the school year. And we know what a deep impact they're having with their community and how it's transforming how they view themselves. With that, I wanted to just give you another shout out for our amazing panelists that we have coming up. And so we just have a quick highlight of showing, Dr. Love is with us. We have Dr. Creston Lynch, we have Curtis Penn in panel 1. And in panel 1 is something that we were somewhat familiar with because we often talk about what are the issues that we see. We talk about problems, we talk about challenges, right? And it's important that we lay that out and that we're really crystal clear in terms of what we're seeing in our communities right now. And so Mr. Rodney Robinson will be leading us in that discussion before we shift to panel 2. And in panel 2, you see that we have Jason Bell, Tristan Glenn, and Rodney is going to be joining us in that panel discussion a little bit more because he's going to be the bridge between our panel 1 and panel 2 discussions as we talk about not just the problems, but what are the solutions. And we're hoping that as you leave here today, that you're able to leave with a roadmap. How can you go back in your community and connect with the young men that you know or people that are connected in this space day to day? And how can we transform what we see and oftentimes in conversations into real world and practical solutions that can impact our communities. So again, just want to thank everyone for being with us today. I'm going to come back a little bit later when we're doing our question and answer portion, but now I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator for today, Mr. Rodney Robinson. Rodney is a 20-year teaching veteran who started teaching at Virgie Binford Education Center in 2015, a school inside Richmond Juvenile Detention Center, in an effort to better understand the school to prison pipeline. He provides a civic-centered education that promotes social emotional growth and creates a collaborative partnership between him and his students. In 2019, Rodney was named National Teacher of the Year by the Council of Chief State Schools Officers. He has received many accolades, too many to recite here today, but I thought it was particularly noteworthy to highlight he has worked with the Pulitzer winning author James Forman to develop curriculum units on race, class, and punishment as a part of the Yale Teachers Institute. He received his bachelor's degree in history from Virginia State University and a master's in educational administration and supervision from VCU in 2011. So please join me in welcoming Rodney to our screens today. And Rodney, you can take it away with our first panel.
It wouldn't be technology if you weren't muted to start it off. But good afternoon. I'm Rodney Robinson. I am the 2019 National Teacher of the Year. And I always say that because you're never a former National Teacher of the Year. You just put the year in front of it and make sure everybody respect your name. But I'm here today as just a pleasure because, for one, I've seen the Leading Men Fellowship in action. You know, in my district, we have that at all of our preschools, and I can drive down the hill to MLK preschool and watch those guys in action and the impact that they have on our young Black boys and girls. And it's just, I mean, if you can get to a classroom to see those guys in action, please take that opportunity because it is inspiring, and it's one of those things that keep you going and say, this is why we do the work that we do, and it keeps us motivated. And so I'm here to lead the panel today with just three distinguished, awesome guests, and I'm just happy to be here. And I want to take the time. I want everybody to introduce themselves and answer the first question at the same time. And I would, at first I got to throw it to my sister. We got connections that go back. We know people who know each other, who know, the world is much smaller than you think it is. But the first question, of course, is what are some of the barriers that prevent young men of color from seeing education as a career option? And I want to throw that to my sister. I want you to introduce yourself and then answer that question. Dr. Love, please enter the chat.
It is wonderful to be with you all. Thank you so much for having me, Literacy Lab. Thank you all for the work that you do. Big time shout out and love to my brother Rodney. Just an amazing beacon of what we mean by an amazing, thoughtful, kind, loving educator. So anytime I get to spend any moment with you, I am always happy. And to all the other brothers on this line, thank you so much for the work that you do, and thank you for having me. I'm a professor at the University of Georgia. I look at how race and anti-Blackness operates within schools and ways in which we can use abolitionist strategies to try to, I would say, not only alleviate, but abolish the ways racism shows up in our schools every day. I think to your question, Rodney, I think since I get to go first, and I know my brothers are going to, slam it out the park, let me just give a little history lesson then. So how do we get where we are? Right? There's a really great book that's going to be coming out on Harvard Press, and I think maybe in like 4 or 5 months, and it's called Pink Slip, the Jim Crow Pink Slip. And so after Brown versus the Board of Education, 1954, Black folks get the pink slip. Black educators and principals get the pink slip. Now, we were educators, we were principals, we were highly educated, highly skilled, and many of those teachers had masters and PhDs that were teaching Black and brown children in their communities, going to their churches, going to their grocery stores. We were building and had a solid network. If you look at the work of Bell Hooks, you look at the work of Vanessa Sutter Walker, you look at those, they tell you about these rich, amazing communities and educators, and how these educators demanded excellence from all students. And we can talk about students with learning disabilities, we can talk about Black boys, Black girls, we can talk about poverty, we can talk about all the ways in which our students show up, and they demanded excellence and got excellence. Now, Brown versus the Board of Education, 1954. This idea that we can use education as a way to leverage our way into integration to the entire society, saying that separate is not equal. And anybody that looks back on Brown would say that we made some success, but the resistance to Brown was massive. And one way that this country resisted integration was the firing of almost 40,000 Black educators after Brown versus the Board of Education. In states that allow Black teachers to teach. We were in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, almost 50% of the teaching force. So when we think about what are the things that hinder, is at the Brown versus Board of Education, we saw school boards put in all types of ridiculous ways in which you could be a teacher. So you saw the decline. You also saw standardized testing start to take place. And what we know is that I live in Georgia, we have the GACE. You have to take the GACE test to become a teacher. There is no way in which that GACE test can determine the type of teacher you are going to be. They cannot prove that, they cannot show that, it does not align, it has nothing to do with teaching. So we have seen the ways in which systematically structures have been put in place to keep Black folks out of teaching. And these systems and these structures are impacting Black boys who become Black men and want to become teachers. And the way in which we have testing and we have structures that perpetually keep them out goes all the way back to the ideas that we are going to try to integrate this country. And that backlash of separate but equal has played out on our teaching force for over the last 70 years. And I'll pass it on to my brothers.
Thank you so much for just that. I'm a history guy, I'm a history teacher. So, you know, I love when someone takes me to school in history, but I tell people all the time, you cannot talk about where we're at without talking about repairing the harm that was done at the end of Brown versus Board of Education. So I truly want to thank you for those words. Next up, Curtis Penn, could you please answer the question and give us a little background on who you are, what you stand for?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Curtis Penn. I'm the Division Director of Justice Services with Belton Institute out here in Oakland, California. In my current role, I work with individuals who are justice impacted, justice involved on a behavioral health spectrum from mild to moderate to severe. Many individuals are chronically homeless, dealing with substance use disorder, and things of that nature. And we do know the impact that education has on the reduction of recidivism, right? It's a known fact. Dr. Love talked really eloquently with respect to systemic injustice, and clearly that leads, in my mind, to socioeconomic constraints, right? The affordability of education. And I will also add, you know, I'm a benefactor of DC public schools. I went to elementary and junior high in DC. The challenge was I moved out here with my father in California, and the change was dynamic with respect to the teachers, the pedagogy, right? And so it impacted my my goals, objectives, and my thought process with respect to education. And that leads me to what I call stereotype priming, where certain stereotypes or activation of stereotypes increases the accessibility of behavior that is associated with certain stereotypes. And out here in the West, you know, they call it the Wild Wild West in some instances. And education is oftentimes looked down upon simply because of the lack of representation, the lack of role models, the lack of advocacy with African-American Black teachers in the public schools in the state of California. And so it led to a hyper incarceration of Black and brown people, you know, through mandatory minimum sentencing laws. And then I myself being justice impacted, formerly incarcerated myself, and seeing some of the challenges that these young Black men had just navigating through the system, the court system, right? They were put at a disadvantage. And so that kind of continues to forge the narrative with respect to education. I had some of my Black brothers, you know, as I was going through school, you know, getting my undergraduate degree and then eventually getting my master's degree, and I would try to, you know, encourage them to go to school because I understood the importance of education and how that can impact recidivism. And oftentimes it was a frowned upon, right? I was looked differently, right? And, they said I spoke differently, and again, I'm a product of DC, right? I grew up there. And so I'm looking at these Black and brown brothers, and I'm thinking to myself, I grew up in an area that was, in the 60s and 70s was 90% Afro-American. So I'm the epitome of what it is to be an African-American, with being a Black man. But nevertheless, you have those challenges because a lot of people are just not knowing or ignorant. And lastly, I will add is, for my personal experience, it was not having the knowledge, the access of what it took to navigate through college. I wasn't aware of the FAFSA system, right? I wasn't, and those things are important because in order to get your credentialing, you have to go through those processes to get your education to become a teacher. And so oftentimes when those obstacles are put in place, you are led to different avenues or different paths that do not result in an outcome of you becoming a teacher. With that, I'll mute. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We know that education is the key to freedom. I often say the revolution will be literate. You can't have any sort of revolution without literate people leading the work. And so I think it's important that we can free ourselves and free our people by just increasing our literacy rates, and more importantly, help some of those brothers who are incarcerated, because we know the direct correlation between literacy and incarceration. And those are brothers who could be in the classrooms leading our young men and young women. Next up, we're going to throw it to Dr. Creston Lynch. Please tell us, what are some of the key barriers that prevent young men of color from seeing education as a career option?
Good afternoon, Rodney, and the rest of the esteemed panelists, as well as the folks who are tuning in virtually. I am indeed honored to be a part of this conversation as well. When I got the invitation, I saw the other panelists, I was a little bit awestruck and maybe a little bit nervous because I see the good work that everybody on this screen is doing. I use some of the work in the classes that I teach. And so if I am able to add value to this conversation, it may mean that I'm doing something right. So I really appreciate being here. I'm Creston Lynch. I serve as the Assistant Vice President for University Life at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, which is right outside of DC. I'm coming to you from my home in Southeast DC, Congress Heights. And so I'm really excited to be here. Yeah. And what I do at Mason that's relevant to this work is I help to support and oversee the Center for Cultural Equity and Empowerment, which serves the comprehensive needs and support for students of color, including our African-American men. And I also help to support our First Gen Plus Center, which supports our first generation, limited income, undocumented, and refugee students. And so when we think about the intersections of race and class, I have an opportunity to see the effects of our educational system and our access challenges and the implications it has for our students, particularly our men going into education. And I also teach cultural pluralism in higher education as an adjunct professor or an adjunct instructor in the School of Higher Education. And when I start that class on the first week, I talk about our education system as a whole being rooted in white supremacy and racism, and the ways in which it constantly repeats itself unless there is an intentional disruption. So I'm really excited about the second portion of this program where we're going to be talking about some of those solutions. But when we think about the intersections of race and class and the way that our financial structures are set up, particularly in higher education, our college tuition prices are increasing exponentially by the year. But when you think about the way in which our government has invested, or the lack thereof of the way in which they've invested in Pell Grants and financial aid, there hasn't been a significant investment, if I'm correct, since 2009 or 2010. And so what we're happening is we're seeing tuition increase, but we're seeing aid be flat, if not decreasing, right? And then we add this concept of social mobility, thinking about our first generation students, our first generation African-American men who are coming to college, not only for themselves, but they're thinking about the social mobility for their families, right? And they are in the position where they're having limited aid. They're either, some of our institutions are front loading their scholarships. So once they get to their junior and senior years, they're having to either take out exorbitant amount of loans or really, race to find other scholarships. They are leaving college in debt. And then all of a sudden, we think about the salary structures of entry-level educators. Doesn't necessarily jive. And so when we're asking our students to, or recruiting our students to become educators, they're like, no, I need to go make some money. So you're asking to take on more debt to go back to graduate schools. And we've talked about our standardized tests. So let's not even talk about the GRE and the GMAT, right? Let's not talk about, we talked about teacher certification tests. And so we're asking them to invest even more, and to go into more debt and then, finish and, and then receive what I would describe as an exploitative salary, right? And so that alone is a barrier in and of itself. I remember a conversation with a student who was complaining about the lack of minority faculty on campus. And the response was, well, have you considered going to graduate school and getting your PhD? And that student's response was, I got to get out of here and make some money, right? And so we have to really think about the way that we are structuring our financial system in higher education, but we also have to figure out ways in which we have to give it up more for our teachers, because we're not going to be able to see that public service unless they're able to support themselves financially. I tell you all the time, going into education is a privilege. I got into education, I was raised in a middle-class family by 2 educators, so I saw educators. And then I didn't graduate with an exorbitant amount of loans, so I was able to live off of what I would refer to as an exploitative salary when I began my career in education. And so everybody is not necessarily that privileged. And so those are some of the things that we have to consider.
All right. I appreciate that. And so for what I'm saying is that Dr. Love said, it's historical. We got to get rid of these historical barriers that are in place. Brother Penn said it's institutional. We need to start attacking the institutions themselves. And then Brother Lynch said it's a financial thing. And so there's so many barriers in place. But to me, I think of a simple barrier. What do you see, every day? A friend of mine sent me a meme, me, I love memes, me. Send me a meme that said, next time you see a tall Black boy, don't tell him he can be a basketball player or football player. Tell him he can be an architect or engineer or doctor or lawyer. I was offended by that because I was like, what about a teacher? Them same skills you got on the court of running the team are the same skills necessary to run a classroom. Dropping back and reading coverages is the same as reading students and making sure you make the right pedagogical decisions. So I think as Americans, we need to be more intentional about the messaging we tell young Black boys and girls that, hey, this is for you. And some of them, let's be honest, they never see us. K through 12. No, I'm gonna just ask a simple question of everybody on this. Dr. Love, when was the first time you had a Black educator in your school system? And what was the importance of that to you?
His name was Larry Clayton. He was my 5th grade elementary school teacher. And I had never seen a Black man that was that graceful, that loving, that kind. He was tall and skinny like me. And what he did for me, I write about it in my book, is that I was a young Black girl, Rochester, New York, came from a working class home, and I found this love of basketball. So just a sidebar, I'm really good at that. But I have found this love of basketball. And I remember one day Mr. Clayton came, and I would leave. So I was a latchkey kid, so I would leave before my parents and they went to work. I had to go to school, so they didn't really know what I was doing in the morning. So I started playing basketball in the morning. And this is upstate Rochester, New York, meaning it's cold 8 months out the year in upstate New York. So I would be out there playing in the rain, and I would come to school dirty. I would come to school hands full of mud, and I would just wipe the mud on myself, and I would go to school. And Mr. Clayton came to me one day, he called us all by our last name. And I just happen to have the last name, Love. He called us all he said, Love, come here. He said, your parents know what you're doing in the morning? I said, no, Mr. Clayton, they don't know. He said, you're pretty good. I said, thank you. He said, I don't want you to stop playing. I see you in the morning. I see what's going on. I can see you, so somebody's watching out for you. But I want you to know this. Don't you ever come to my class dirty again. I want you to get up every morning and bring an extra pair of clothes. So I want you to play like you've been playing. And then before you come to my class, I want you to pull out an extra pair of clothes and I want them ironed. And that's between me and you. I said, I got you, Mr. Clayton. I've been clean ever since. I've been clean ever since. I'm in a hotel room right now, so I've been clean ever since. But he just showed me so much love and compassion, and I needed to hear. My father was not an athlete. My father didn't own a pair of sneakers. I needed to hear that I could play, that somebody saw me. But he also challenged me to be better. And those are the conversations that I don't think any white teacher or any woman teacher actually could have been able to have to me at that time. So I will never forget a Mr. Larry Clayton. And it's funny, I just learned his first name about 2 years ago, because you never know their first names. Like they're Mr. So-and-so and so-and-so. And I was talking to a group of folks back in Rochester. They were like, Larry? I was like, ooh, his name is Larry? Like, it just didn't even hit me that he had a first name, and here I am 40-something years old. It's just amazing the impact that this Black teacher had on me, and I am forever, forever grateful.
Thank you for that personal story. Brother Penn, tell us about your first Black male teacher, or if you had a Black male teacher. Let's be honest, some of us don't get that luxury.
Yeah, I've had a number of Black male teachers, but the one that comes to mind that I recall is when I was in community college. I was going to a predominantly white community college in an affluent neighborhood. It was kind of across the tracks, if you will. And he was my English teacher, right? I don't recall his name. And I thought I was relatively smart. And he would give us an assignment. We would have to write. And when I would get it back, it would be, completely filled with red ink, where he would mark this off and you did this wrong. And I mentioned that it was in an affluent area because I was probably only one or two of Black students in the class. And initially I'm thinking, he's a Black teacher. He's gonna show me some love, if you will, no pun intended. And in fact, it was just opposite. He was very hard on me, right? And I can't, it's been so long ago, I can't recall the conversation that we had, but I will say that it prompted me to do better because I was just tired of seeing all this red ink on my paper. And so the objective was to get less and less and less red ink to the point where I did not get any red ink, right? And I ended up graduating with honors with a 3.52 cumulative GPA. But I will add that in order for me to get my associate's degree, I had to take a vocabulary test, which I could not pass, right? And this is probably to encourage people who look like me to go to the school across the tracks, right? But nevertheless, I just continued and I found another outlet, right? I took this other class to, in place of taking the vocabulary test, I end up passing, and then I graduated, I think it was 1 or 2, we walked across to get the diploma, and I just, put my fist up and thought about the Black teacher that I had, and I walked across, and that was a moment that I won't forget. Thank you.
Appreciate that honesty. Dr. Lynch, you want to share with us a little bit?
Yeah, I thank you for that question because you have me seriously reminiscing back here. My first Black male teacher was my 7th grade pre-algebra teacher, Reverend Obadiah Hall. So who was a preacher and a mathematician, and he approached them both with the same passion. He would often say, as we were working through our problems, you have to know that you know that you know that you know. And so I carry that with me. And he also taught me 8th grade algebra. And so he was the first person to give me a C as well. And because I had 2 parents that were educators, bringing a C home at that point in time was just not a very wise thing to do. But as I reflect on that, he was a teacher who would not allow me to skate. He would not allow me to go through the motions. He held me accountable. He held me to a higher standard, and he knew that bringing home that C was going to create a response, because I was going to have to go in here and fix this grade, because I played 8th grade basketball. I was nowhere near as good as Dr. Love was, but at the same time, I did what I could with with the talent that I had at that time. And so I knew that I wasn't going to be able to play basketball if I didn't get these grades up. And so that allowed me to spend more time with him and just challenged me to be better, right? And just kind of instill that level of discipline that it took for me to persevere to the point where I am right now. So shout out to Reverend Obadiah Hall.
I just want to thank you guys for those personal moments. You know, I got to talk about mine. That's Calvin Sorrell. He was my 5th grade band teacher, and I took him 5th grade all the way up through 12th grade. Every year, I got to hang with Mr. Sorrell. Even when he coached girls softball, I managed a softball team, and I told my friends, yeah, I get to hang with the girls. But the reality was I was get to hang with Mr. Sorrell a little more, because growing up in a predominantly white system on the honors track, you get that identity confusion. You know, folks tell you you're different, you're better. You know, they're my brothers, my friends, you know? And Mr. Sorrell, he helped me navigate that. He helped me discover who I was. And so by all your stories, you know, we talk about the importance of the Black male educator. We know it's the cultural tax, you know, to helping people understand who they are. We know about the high expectations we had for our students. We know that, you know, we can talk studies all day. We know that others don't have the same expectation for Black kids as our own, you know. And then, of course, we want to talk about the fact that disappointment, you know, when you got a young Black kid who comes into a class and they see Black teachers. I remember my 2nd year, 2 kids walked into the class, they said, we got a brother, and high-fived each other. You know what I mean? Those are the moments that can't be replaced, and that's why we're so necessary in our class, and we got to work about overcoming these barriers. And so as we move, we're going to take a break right now, but on this break, what I want you to do, I want you to think about that Black male teacher you had and the importance they had. If you can shoot them an email, text, call, or something today. And then when we come back after 5 minutes, we're going to hear another awesome poem from my brother from the DMV, Dr. Keith Jr. So just take that break and we'll see you in 5.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back. Thank you again for joining us for Ascend Part 2, Forging the Narrative. Hope you enjoyed the first part of our panel discussion, and it generated a lot of thoughts for you. I know I immediately reached out to 2 of my favorite Black male teachers, Mr. Baker and Dr. Michael Townsend. I don't even know Mr. Baker's first name, but I shot them an email and I said, thank you for what you did in my life. So I hope you did the same. Just a quick reminder before we get started with the second half of our programming. If you do have any questions for our panelists, please start putting them into your chat box, and we'll be reading those questions towards the end to make sure that we could address all of your questions and comments. But I'm excited to say a little bit of words about our guest, special guest that joined us at the beginning at the top, Dr. Tony Keith. Dr. Tony Keith is an award-winning spoken word artist. He's a poet, he's an essayist, he's a hip hop educator. Dr. Keith is a former multicultural administrator and professor of cultural studies at the University of the District of Columbia, Penn State University, and the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. Currently, he is the founder and CEO of EdMC Academy, an educational consulting company for poets, spoken word artists, rappers, and MCs. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to him to continue to inspire us before we get ready with our second panel discussion. Tony, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much for the introduction. I was actually going to share that I was an EdMC. Just for quick context, folks, I'm essentially an evolved teaching artist, right? And so the poem that I'm going to share right now, which means I don't necessarily work in traditional educational spaces. I'm not a classroom teacher, right? Like I work with nonprofit after-school programs, tutoring programs, community-based spaces. And so the poem that I'm going to share right now is one that I spit for some fellas last week. When I say fellas, I do some contract work with an organization in DC, a nonprofit called Free Minds Book Club. And they work with young men and who are incarcerated and all that kind of mess. And so anyway, I was at the DC Youth Rehabilitation Services Center last Monday, and I was, facilitating some spoken word poetry workshops and hip hop. And I'm looking at young Black men, who absolutely look just like me. And I know where they're going. Most of them weren't going home anytime soon, right? They're gonna be in there for a while, or they're getting transferred to some other place. And so I spit this poem for them. And so I'm thinking about them in this moment. And so just know that this poem is also about these narratives. Somebody was talking about stereotypes. And so this poem is for them. I'm going to modify my language a bit because the way that I would share this with y'all is a little bit different than I would share with young men who are locked up with no restrictions. So words have power. Letters are electrically charged and when bounded together can create enough energy to cause massive explosions. Words can blow massive mountaintops into tiny metaphorical erosions, and it'll be I standing atop one of those mounds with words, vowels, syllables, phrases, and sounds, and I'll be screaming. This is for all of my brothers still dreaming. Those of you whose hue were black until you've been beaten down to blue, who don't really know who you are because you're busy letting society define you, ain't got a pot to piss in, a window to throw it out of, and no food to chew, and so you're starving. Starving for knowledge, not because you can't grasp the language, but because no one took the time to teach you, claiming that you're too stubborn to listen to, that your head's too thick to get a brick through, that you're nothing but a no good, pants sagging, baby making, juvenile delinquent. That all you're capable to do, brothers, is eat, sleep, poop, and screw. But today I got something different to tell you. And as I do, I invoke in myself the spirit of everything African within me. From my forehead to my collarbone, from my bloodstream to my skin tone, from my strong back to my humble knees, from my shin bone to my calloused feet. And brothers, I declare you free. No longer property, no longer a weapon for society to continue to arm you with massive missiles of misguided perceptions of manhood into your looking glasses. So forget sitting in the back, writing RIP to your friends on that desk. You're now in the front teaching those classes. And forget being afraid to use slang. I'm granting you the right to use the language of your people to move the masses. And if people say you didn't pay your way, say, don't worry, it's already being deducted from my taxes. Now they say they got questions, tell them they can find it printed on paper receipts made from trees once used to whip enslaved Africans' backs. And if they still got questions, tell them I can call up the Black men's headquarters and have them send it out through smoke signals or Morse code dashes. If they still got questions, tell them they can take a pen and prick your skin and check your deoxyribonucleic acid, better known as your DNA, because brothers, they don't need answers, brother. They don't need anything. And if they do, you tell them to come see me because I got you. I'm holding y'all up on my shoulders, giving y'all a higher view. I'm wading through muddy waters and mountaintops, and don't worry because historically, I've been able to split those things in two. So brothers, if I got to fight your battles, and brothers, if I got to take your blows, don't you worry, brothers, I will do it for you, and I'll do it and I'll smile. Smile as pure in the poems and the metaphors of Langston Hughes and as cool as the vibrato in B.B. King's blues. And I'll do it while wearing a cool pair of black pants, black socks, black shoes, some black socks, and I don't know, and some rest of, I don't know, I got lost in my poem there, but I'll be looking like the rest of the men in the morning news, but instead I'll be screaming newsflash, newsflash, Black men America's trying to take your freedom, but they can't take the rest of you. They claim they got you by the balls, but let's face it, you're a Black man and they got small hands so they can barely grip one of your testicles. Tell them they need to step their game up, take some vitamin C and eat some more vegetables. But brothers, no matter what they do, they will never be stronger than you. We fight with one fist in the air, but with me beside you, we fight with the power of two. So until you have gained the wisdom, brothers, until you have learned how to work the system, until you can walk with your footsteps next to mine, don't worry, brothers, I'm gonna carry you. As long as you remember to pick up and carry those brothers left behind. Thank y'all so much, Literacy Lab. I'm everywhere, at Tony Keith Jr., all the things. Peace.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you so much again, Tony. Really enjoy. I hope that inspires a lot of our young men that are listening right now and that may hear this after when we rebroadcast. So really appreciate you being with us today. As I mentioned, we're going to transition into our second panel today. I'm really excited that we have Jason Bell, Tristan Glenn, and Rodney is going to be joining us also as the moderator one more time as we try to really have an in-depth conversation about some possible solutions to some of the challenges that we heard at the top of the hour. Rodney, take it away.
Yes, thank you, Ivan. So welcome back. Like I said, I hope you had a moment to reflect and to shoot somebody a quick text, email, or just send them some love if you got a chance. And so part one of our panel today, we talked about the historical barriers, the institutional barriers, and the financial barriers that are preventing young men of color from seeing education as a career option. And so in this time, we're gonna talk about solutions. You know, I had a Black principal told me, look, Robinson, I don't care about your problems. I need to know what your solutions are to the problems. And so that's what we're gonna talk about right now. What can we do? And so I got some good brothers with me today. You know, first I'm gonna throw it to Jason Bell. Mr. Bell, tell us a little bit about yourself. But the key question I want you to answer is, what are some key actions that individuals and organizations can take to create new narratives about what is possible for young men of color in education?
Okay, well, thank you for allowing me in this space first. I mean, that's the most important thing. I am truly privileged today. My name is Jason Bell. I'm the Executive Director of Project Rebound here at San Francisco State University and the Director of Program Development for the entire state consortium of Project Rebounds, and adjunct professor in a couple of departments on campus. But in reference to the question about what can we do, it's complicated, Rodney. We gotta, take that into consideration, that there's a huge responsibility in this education piece. Some of it is definitely a systematic issue, but some of it is on us as individuals. And I feel I take that and wear that on my shoulders, that responsibility, because I contributed to that for many, many years. And our whole concept, like, for many of you, you don't know what Project Rebound is. What we do is we work with formerly incarcerated folks after prison and cater them into higher education. I myself, long before all of these positions, was a rebound student myself. So I sit here in the home of the only college of ethnic studies in the nation, San Francisco. I don't know if you know the history of San Francisco State, but there was a huge strike in the 60s. So this education piece is important. I learned a lot coming here after many, many years of incarceration. But what I learned is in respect to this individual responsibility and the systematic responsibility, a lot of folks I knew and respected in that lifestyle, that the concept of doing good, oftentimes meant staying alive and staying out of prison. But what that equates to oftentimes, so people that are doing good are oftentimes holding a job. It could be a job at Walmart or wherever, and staying out of prison and all those are great things. I'm not saying that they're not, but what's oftentimes left out of that equation is the importance of education and pursuing it, and oftentimes being in positions to teach others. So that whole aspect, and we weren't getting it. And where I truly learned this lesson in when I was in graduate school, I had an opportunity to work at this log cabin boys ranch. In the Bay Area, they stopped sending a lot of people to youth prisons. They would send them up to this log cabin boys ranch. It was a lighter version of a state system, much smaller. But I'm talking to some of these young men. Some of them had some pretty serious cases. And I'm talking to them about the people that they idolize, they look up to and respect. And oftentimes it was, oftentimes it was rappers or sports icons. And they said, well, why is that? Why does it always have to be the same group of folks? And they said, well, there's no doctors, there's no lawyers coming in here to talk to us. And I realized, that's right. So we got this huge responsibility as we step into these places to make time to do that. So that on that end of the spectrum is, as we come into these positions, we got to remember that. We got to have the discussions like this Black think tanks and share ideas that we can get to these communities that need us the most, because there's so many folks that are still bought into that idea of doing, the limitations of doing good is just being alive and staying out of prison. And we gotta think a little deeper. We gotta dig a little deeper. We gotta do a little more in that respect on a personal level. I did notice that. So I guess that's my 2 cents from that.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I got to look up a little bit of history of the university. I don't know, so now I got to go find out. That's just me. I got to go Google it. But now I want to throw it to Dr. Tristan Glenn. What are some key actions individuals and organizations can take to create new narratives about what is possible for young men of color in education? You're muted, Dr. Glenn.
All right. So, listen, I know we've all heard that more than enough over the last 2 years that you're muted, as we've found new residents in Zoom and Teams and all other online meeting platforms. But again, thank you, Brother Robinson, for throwing it to me. I also want to send a special thank you to the representatives of the Literacy Lab and the great work that they're doing, particularly in assembling such a dynamic panel of individuals, because I've truly been blessed by the rich discourse that have taken place today. It's always encouraging to see individuals come together and think strategically, intentionally, and meaningfully about the things that need to be done, the ways in which we go about improving the outcomes of young men of color, particularly Black males. The question that you present is a highly complex question, right? And those of us who are in this space know and understand that there's no simple answer to this, right? The beauty is that we have a collective effort that is aimed at attending to it. So when I think about it, and in my work as an assistant professor of special education and the director of the Call Me Mr. program here in the Bagwell College of Education at Kennesaw State University, my work focuses on teacher preparation, social justice education, and educational equity. So when I hear narratives, my mind goes directly to a belief that I have that the first and foremost, the most essential action that individuals must take is to work to cultivate a level of consciousness within organizations, and particularly in schools, that the pernicious meta-narrative about the intellectual and behavioral tendencies of men of color has pathologized our differences and obscured our gifts. So how do we do this? I think we do this through the intentional telling and purposeful promotion of counter-narratives, right? The kinds of narratives articulated by the Call Me Mr. community or the Leading Men Fellows through the Literacy Lab, right? These narratives tell a much more inclusive and robust conception of who Black men are. And this is important because counter-narratives offer an exciting opportunity to challenge and correct, and even more so, more importantly, reframe the discourse on the potential of men of color, because that discourse centers and situates us as a problem as opposed to an asset. And we all know, right, being viewed as a problem, it is then deemed that you must be controlled, right? So imagine that, carrying that narrative with you into a school environment and the ways in which that informs, influences, and impacts your lived experience within the school. So once these narratives are created, then we can begin to have a much more inclusive reimagination of schooling as they are currently constituted. A reimagination process that is inclusive of the thoughts and desires of not only representatives of the white dominant community, but members of the communities that this current system is intentionally aiming to leave behind. I appreciate Sister Love's comments at the outset about how schools, the only material change in schools at the conclusion of Brown v. Board was the releasing of young men, young children from communities of color into a hostile, anti-Black site of violence, as our brother Michael Dumas talks about, that then resulted in them being forced to bear the inequitable burden of assimilation, as opposed to a school being restructured, reimagined in a way that was much more culturally responsive and inclusive, right? And as she articulated, Sister Love, we sent those children without any support, without any protection. And unfortunately, we're here today because for countless young boys of color, Black boys in particular, we still have an absence of that level of protection and mentorship, right? So once we begin that process of deconstructing the meta-narrative, creating the consciousness that schools as currently constituted will not work and have not worked for countless generations of children of color from historically minoritized backgrounds from under-resourced communities, then we can begin the process of thinking strategically as to where our schools have deficits. Once we demonstrate an intention, once we do that, we have to attend to what we've all talked about thus far, right? That young men aren't inclined to identify teaching as a pathway. I believe that the reality is this: young brothers can't see themselves as teachers because they've rarely seen themselves as teachers, right? So when they navigate the schooling process, teaching as a career pathway is not front of mind because they haven't seen them in that space. Currently, 2% of the teaching population is Black males. Conversely, 76% of the teaching population is white females. When I consider critically those statistics, it's not any level of news that or shock that 79% of the teaching pipeline, meaning students who are studying to become educators, are white females, right? So how do we attend to this? What is that action step that we're hoping to see, right? The action step that I believe is that we must demonstrate intentionality in establishing a pipeline for males of color to enter the field. Now, this pipeline must include the resources necessary to account for the many barriers that we've discussed today, because those barriers often inhibit the trajectories of many individuals from communities of color that we know are far too under-resourced. And as we do that, I give you a process and a program that we can begin to promote that has been doing the work since the year 2000. That is the Call Me Mr. program. We need to promote and further fund the work of Call Me Mr., which is an educator development and mentorship program which started in 2000 and aims to place more Black males in schools. I am here today off of a wonderful opportunity to interact with Brother Douglas and how he is transitioning the Leading Men Fellowship to the Metro Atlanta area. And we're thinking about how can we foster partnerships that are intentionally embedded into the most needed communities that speak and breathe life into the young men and create a level of consciousness, awareness, and value among them and how they can give back to their community as educators. So finally, I'll leave two quotes with you. One from the CEO and founder of Call Me Mr., where he speaks, Dr. Jones says, "Call Me Mr. seeks out capable Black men who can reach out to children who need positive role models and dedicated mentors, thereby elevating the school community." I also like, and I'm fond of the words of, that's important because it speaks to the critical importance for all children that Black men are in the school building in various capacities, right? And how Jay-Z speaks to the great philosopher, poet, and urban lyricist, Sean Carter. Why is it important for Black men to be in the building? Because when Black men are in the building, we don't just shine, we illuminate the whole show, right? Thereby raising the entire school culture. So those are some initial ideas as to action steps, right? We need to identify the resources and further fund such programs as Leading Men Fellows, Call Me Mr., because the chief goal of my program at Call Me Mr. is to eliminate all barriers, particularly those of the financial form, through school scholarships to support students in their attempt to become educators. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Glendon. You know, I'm an advisor on the board of Call Me Mr. at Longwood University here in Virginia, so I know the impact that program can have. And I remember my first meeting with the young men. I saw a young freshman in there by the name, I never forget, his name was Jonathan Brooks. And on his name tag, he had Dr. Jonathan Brooks. And I said, wait a minute, you're a freshman? He's like, yeah, I'm a freshman, but by the time I leave this university, I'm going to be Dr. Jonathan Brooks. You know, and so to me, that let me know, okay, this program is about it because it's teaching these young brothers to see what they want to be. And so in my work, you know, I was National Teacher of the Year, you know, and I went around the country and I often said, you know, I represent two groups who don't typically get the mic in educational conversations. Number one, kids in alternative settings, and 2 Black male teachers. It's only been 3 of us in the history of the National Teacher of the Year program. And so as I've gone around the country seeing so many people and meeting and having these conversations, I was lucky enough to come back to my district and start a program called RVA Men Teach. And our goal is to support and recruit male minority teachers in the city of Richmond. And this was part of our 5-year strategic plan, because the community said, look, we need more Black and brown male teachers, and we need to set up something to do it. And so one of the first things I did when I started this program was I started talking to them, bro, what you need? Because if I'm not talking to the key stakeholders, then what am I doing? So I started talking to them. They said, look, number one, we need to start dealing with the culture of these schools that is not representative or welcoming to Black male teachers. I was like, so bet. All right, so I checked it off. Then they said, we need to do more uplifting of our young Black men and promoting the education field to them. Bet, so I'm having these conversations. And so now I'm in charge of teacher leader pathways. You done gave me the keys to the car. So now it's time to start driving. You quoted Jay-Z, your favorite rapper. I'm gonna quote my favorite rapper, Pimp C. On his last album, he had a song called Knocking Doors Down. And that's what I'm doing right now, is I'm knocking these doors down to get more Black educators in the pipeline. Number one, I'm keeping the ones we already got. I'm making sure that they're getting advancement opportunities, professional development opportunities, those same opportunities that's been denied to them. I'm making sure that they're alert and aware of all these opportunities. Number two, I'm going to colleges and universities, and we're talking to these, we're mentoring. We have a program called Distinguished Fellows with VCU University, where my teachers and RVA Men Teach, they're mentoring the young brothers in college in our VCU Young Male Teachers, Male Minority Teachers program. Those brothers in college are mentoring the high school brothers who want to go to education. And those high school brothers are mentoring the middle school brothers who want to go into education. Because the reality is, we want you to be fully aware of what you're stepping into. It's not just a job, this is a calling. And we want you to know when you step into this calling, you will have a network of brothers here to support you and uplift you when you come into the field. And so it's really important that we start tackling these barriers. Second thing we got to do, we got to look at license. We got to have conversations about how this licensing thing is really just gatekeeping and keeping certain people out of the profession. So we're having a conversation with the Virginia Department of Education. What can we do to get more brothers licensed? One thing we did in our district was we looked at a lot of our teaching assistants. And then we did a survey. We got 150 teaching assistants with 4-year bachelor degrees. Why are you a teaching assistant? We're gonna put in the work so that you're a fully licensed teacher. And we're going to work with the DOE to make sure they have the supports in place. We're going to make sure the schools are welcoming places. We need to stop pretending that these schools are welcoming places for Black men. They are not. We keep saying, I can't keep telling a young person to come back into the place where you keep getting mistreated. Nobody's going to go back to that scene of their trauma as a career field. And so we need to start having these conversations about our schools welcoming to Black people. I remember another local district, they started a program and they said, we want competent male teachers of color in our district. And I was like, wait a minute, you don't say that when you go look for white female teachers or other teachers. You don't put that word competent in there. So why are you putting that in there for us? That is a racial abuse toward us. And I'll tell all Black men in college, if you see a district saying something like that, do not go to that district. That's only a small inkling of the stuff you're going to have to deal with every day. And so one thing we have to, number one, we have to keep it real with our young brothers and tell them that when you go into the field, these are the expectations for you. And then we have to support them when they get there. And last but not least, we need to put some money in these brothers' pockets. We need to come up with some ways, some bonuses, some incentives, some different ways, going through the philanthropic route, going through the community route. How can we put some extra money in your pocket to help pay for that invisible tax that you have to go through every single day in school? And so those are some of the ways that we've thought about reimagining education and making it possible for just male minority teachers. And, we talk about Black men, but we got to shout out our brown brothers because that number is under 2% as well. We need to make sure that those opportunities are available for them. And so we really want to make sure it's a welcoming space with opportunities for people to grow. And so with that, we're going to open up the floor, the room to questions. I'm pretty sure we have a ton of questions for everybody on the panel. And I'm going to throw it to Ivan, who want to get the questions started.
Great. Thank you, Rodney. Lots of ideas been thrown out there. I really appreciate, the lively discussion that we've had so far. We do have a number of questions from our audience, and I'm going to start actually by combining two. We have Peter Lucas from the Renewal Foundation and Danae Davis from Milwaukee Succeeds that's talking about this narrative that we're expressing today and how we can start early with our youngest children. How will these ideas, these new narratives be spread not only amongst young men, but young boys in grade school? Another way of asking the same question that came from Danae Davis with Milwaukee Succeeds, can the panelists talk more about how we engage our youth in the reimagining and changing the narrative about Black males? Because we've so far talked about just the young men, the adults. So can we speak a little bit more about our children maybe and how we can start early with this new narrative that we're trying to construct?
I guess I'll take a quick pass at that because it speaks to an initiative that I'm engaged in now. Over the last 2 years, I've had been forced to contend with the difficulties that we've discussed today in terms of recruitment, right? Like it's having resources is one thing. Yeah, I mean, I stand on the yard on our campus and wave a check and say, hey, I got money for you to come be a teacher. And young brothers look at me and they say, teacher is not for me, right? And that problem exists because, as Brother Robinson said, schools are not currently constructed viewed as a place where young Black men can thrive. It's a place they must survive, right? Like they have to go through this traumatic experience to get to a thing, right? Schools are the most oftentimes the most safe space that they have in their community, right? They got to go to school because mama, grandma, whoever say you got to get out of this house, right? But that doesn't speak to what school should be. So what I've realized is this: in terms of speaking to and tapping into those young men very early on before they get to high school and start making career choices, we got to tap into them at an earlier age and begin to partner them with mentors and other men that look like them that can give them another depiction of success that is much more realistic and attainable than the less than 1% of us who dribble a basketball, play football, cultural and music influences, right? So, and me thinking about this, I've developed what I call the Future Misters Academy. This academy is an intensive 3 to 5 day experience, depending on funding, however much money I can get each year. But what I do is I bring young men beginning the age of 6th grade up into their 11th grade year, and they come to KSU and they stay on campus. They live in our dorms. They eat in our halls. They engage in learning experiences on campus. And then the most beautiful part and what I'm most encouraged by is once they leave and go back into the school system, they're partnered with a Black male mentor that is throughout my network of educators that I've been able to assemble throughout my time as a Black male, as an educator, right? So that's how you begin to disrupt that narrative and begin to breathe life into those young men that mentor then carries with them. Because what we cannot do assume that they will have the opportunity that by chance they'll land into that Black male's class. I don't know who said it earlier, but one of you said, some young brothers walked in your class and said, yes, we got a brother. We can't take for granted that might not happen for most of us. So we got to think about other ways. And that's just one of the ways in which I've considered and I'm excited about moving forward.
Great.
And if I could just,
go ahead, Dr. Love. Go ahead.
I could just add to that really quickly, because I think what Brother Green is saying is so important, is that if we know these structures and we know these institutions are death-dealing structures that are based in anti-Blackness, and we know that it's going to take an overhaul to undo these institutions, meaning that everybody on this call, we will not see what we are talking about. We will not see it. That does not mean that it can't happen tomorrow. We got to have that mentality. So what I'm saying to you is that we need to build the structures outside of the schools. We need to do the after school programs at the church, at the Boys and Girls Club. We got to get the Black males in our community to come into those spaces and be with those young people in the capacity and way in which we can make it happen and sustainable for our own communities. We know a playbook. We have a playbook. It has been done. Our ancestors did not leave us without a playbook. We go back to the playbook that they left us, of how we create and sustain in our own communities when there is a need. And so as we try to move and integrate schools with more Black males and more Black teachers in general, we also know that it's not going to happen overnight. So in the end time, in between time, we have to create these institutions outside of the structures.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Love. I just wanted to add too, something struck me when Rodney was speaking earlier about, you said talking about being offended when you were hearing about what the Black male could be. And I think about our youngest children when we have career days at our schools and they see all these different careers that come before them. And one of the few that is always lacking is a teacher. Like, how can we make sure that we bring more men of color, African-American and our Latino brothers? How can we bring them in the space intentionally for young children to see teachers that look like them? They may not see them every day, but maybe even just on a career day, they can see themselves. And that will start to change the mindset. And we can do that as early as kindergarten. We can do that in the preschool level. We take them to see so many other types of careers, but we don't emphasize the joys of being a teacher. And I think if we start early with that, that could start the pipeline that we're talking about at the youngest ages. Want to shift really quickly, anytime we have a discussion about young men of color, Black and brown young men that we want to be in education, we want to hear their voices directly. So I'm really excited that one of our Leading Men alumni is joining us, Malcolm Hudson, and he was a 2017-2018 Leading Men Fellow. And he asked, what advice would you give to an individual who may feel hopeless, who struggles with procrastination as they're trying to decide their next moves?
Find your pack. Find your pack of brothers that's gonna move with you. You know how a pack moves together. And if you're not holding up your end, they're gonna pull you along. And so you got to find that community of young brothers who are gonna motivate you, who are gonna hold you accountable. It's nothing wrong with having a group of friends, to get along with, but you also need that friend who's gonna kick you in the butt and say, hey, it's time to step up. It's time to do better. And to me, those are the best friends. And so what I suggest you do is find your community, reach out to other leading fellows. Heck, reach out to me. We got to support each other in this network if we want to keep it going, and just say, hey, I need an encouraging word. Bam, here comes an encouraging word. We just got to support each other because to quote G Money, we all we got, and so we got to keep supporting each other.
And to add on that, I would just say real quickly, as leaders, we have to understand the certain modalities that are needed to work with a population who what we call pre-contemplative, in the stages of change, or ambivalent to change, right? And I know certain modalities that we use with the population that we work with, because have been so inundated with negative thoughts that we have to use what's called cognitive behavioral intervention to get their thoughts and behaviors change, right? But it's self-centered. It's motivated based on their own issues. And we use certain wellness recovery action plans where we can remind them of certain tools that they've used in the past that worked. And just to reflect back on that initial question, when you asked about the educator, my first educator was actually my grandmother, who was Blackfoot Indian and African. And I thought there were times when I went in the household and I would say things, vernacularly in the wrong context. And she would say, he, she, and it, use this kind of phrase. And I knew right then and there, I had said something in the wrong context with respect to the subject verb analogy. And I had to think back. And so with respect to what Dr. Love talked about, having that education outside of the schools, in the community, it has to be in the family household as well. That's where we can reach these young youth. With that on me.
And if I can just add really quickly, I had a similar conversation to my 22-year-old nephew who is really in that place, recently graduated from college and is kind of struggling to to find his way. And the questions that I asked him to ask himself were to think about what he cares about. You know, we think about when we're going through high school, we're going through college, we have been conditioned to do what we are told or do what we are asked to do in order to get to the end, right? Because we're navigating the system. And so it's like, whatever I got to do to get through it, let me do it. And by the time we're done, it's like, okay, well, what meaning did I really make out of this experience? So take some time to reflect on what it is you actually care about, not what it is, not how much money that you want to make, not what it is that you want to be, but what is it that you care about? And then think about what you're good at. What are some of the things that you would do that when you wouldn't get paid? And so when we're thinking about teaching, when we think about going into education, people say, I don't want to be a teacher because they don't want to be the type of teachers that they may have had. But that doesn't mean that they can't be a part of this system and then make significant progress in disrupting that system, right? And so I think it's important for us to think about what we care about, what we're good at, and what ways we might be able to contribute to, as Dr. Love talked about, really, tearing down and rebuilding this educational system that we all want to see.
Great. I'm just looking at the clock. I want to respect everyone's time. I know we have only a couple minutes left. Two things I wanted to do. Rodney, just wanted to throw it to you really quickly. If you wanted to recap our time together, we had some questions we weren't able to get to, but the good news is that we are going to try to give you not only a copy of the recording, but also some notes. Because again, we wanted this to be a working group and we want you to see the notes and the thoughts about how we can take this conversation and turn it into action. So that's going to be next. But Rodney, why don't you close us out with a few words? And then Heather, I don't know if you wanted to say any final words as we end today. Rodney?
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for showing up today. We're still in the middle of a panorama, despite what people try to make you think, and you dedicated your time to be with us today. And so one thing I want to point out is that I think we're hitting the point of a national emergency because we kept saying 2%, but the reality is that number is 1.6. It was 2% a couple years ago. Now we're down to 1.6. So that means we're falling. The brothers that were in education are leaving, and we need to make this a national priority because we all know the numbers. We know that Black children perform best when they have Black teachers. Our ancestors knew that. That's why they resisted the Freedmen's Bureau and other things that came down south to try to take control of their education. We know that based on all the studies. Shout out to Sister Constance Lindsay, who did that wonderful study to let us know, hey, if you got a Black teacher in elementary school, you're 39% less likely to drop out of high school. And so in education, we always talk about database best practices. But when those things don't center whiteness, all of a sudden, we don't want to have that conversation. So I think it's really important that we've hit the point of a national emergency. It's time to hold your local legislators to task, time to take your state and national legislators to task. We need to call Joe Biden. We need to say, we need to have this conversation. And we know you got a brown person as Secretary of Education and Brother Cardona. So he understands these problems. We need to have a national conversation because the future of our young Black boys and girls is at stake. Because the reality is, if a white child in America gets a bad education, oh, well, they're going to be all right. If a Black child gets a bad education in America, it's literally a matter of life and death. And so we're saying this right now. This is a national emergency. We need all hands on deck. Hashtag we need Black teachers. Thank you.
I know we are over time. I just want to thank our speakers so much for your time today. Thank our audience for being here. And please stay tuned as we go through our first strategic planning process and expect to hear a lot more about the future of the Literacy Lab and the Leading Men Fellowship. So thank you all so much for your time today.
Everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
This was amazing. This was amazing. Thank you so much.